We are very lucky to have our two panelists with us, not only because they are great leaders themselves, but also as individuals, they served in positions in which I think give them great credibility to talk about the case study that we're going to talk about today. The first is Janine Davidson. Janine is currently the president of Metropolitan State University. She is a former professor at George Mason University Schar School. And perhaps most importantly, from the perspective of our conversation, she was the former undersecretary of the Navy for President Obama. She also served as an officer and as a pilot in the United States Air Force for 10 years. Our second panelist is Bruce Lindsay. Bruce was a career U.S. naval officer. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy. He was a naval aviator, and he served in a large number of officer and command positions in the Navy. In particular, he commanded carrier strike groups. That's going to be important here, I think, in a little bit. So he was actually the boss of the commander of an aircraft carrier. And in the very, very small world department, Bruce served as the executive officer on the USS Theodore Roosevelt. So wow, it doesn't get much better than that. So welcome to both Janine and to Bruce. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to get together on this.
Okay, so before we get to the first question, I thought it kind of important to lay out the kind of basic facts of the case study so that everybody who's listening in understands what we're talking about and that we're on the same wavelength. So let me just give you a number of data points, hopefully with no analysis included, just data points. So in late March, a number of sailors test positive for coronavirus aboard the Theodore Roosevelt. Also in late March, the captain of the Roosevelt, Crozier, has a number of conversations with his senior officers, the carrier strike group commander, remember Bruce played those roles, and the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, so his other chain of command. On March 30th, he sends a letter via email. The commander Crozier sends a letter via email on a non-secure, unclassified system to 20 to 30 DoD officials, including a number of people outside of his chain of command. The letter asks for the crew to be evacuated from the ship and lays out dire warnings about the sailors being at risk, and actually says sailors don't need to die from coronavirus. April 1st, the very next day, the letter is published in full by the San Francisco Chronicle. The next day, April 2nd, the acting Secretary of the Navy, Thomas Modly, relieves Captain Crozier of his command. April 3rd, the very next day, videos show the sailors on the Theodore Roosevelt cheering for their captain as he departs the ship the last time. April 4th, President Trump, remember the commander-in-chief here, says publicly that he thought that the captain's writing of the letter was, quote, a terrible thing, unquote. April 5th, the acting Navy secretary flies out to the ship and delivers the crew a 15-minute speech criticizing Captain Crozier, calling him too naive or too stupid to be a commanding officer, and actually chiding the sailors for cheering his departure from the ship. April 6th, there is intense media and Democratic criticism of the acting Navy secretary. And President Trump says publicly that he will get involved in the issue, but he doesn't say how. April 7th, the very next day, the Navy secretary resigns. And finally, on April 10th, in kind of a weird twist to this whole thing, Defense Secretary Esper says publicly that he is open to reinstating Crozier as commander of the Theodore Roosevelt. So, wow. What a 2 weeks, right, Janine, Bruce? 2 firings, an embarrassed U.S. Navy, and a distraction from the 2 things, right, that really matter, dealing with the coronavirus and maintaining military readiness. So, Bruce, let me start with you. Let me ask you, what do you think Commander Crozier was thinking as he was going through this? Why do you think he did what he did? What did he do right, and what did he do wrong?
Okay, Michael, that's some good questions. First, what is going through the mind of a commanding officer in an aircraft carrier? Okay, he's responsible for 2 nuclear reactors, about 5,000 sailors, the $13 billion warship, and probably $6 billion worth of aircraft. So he has a lot of things on his mind. But it is evident from what we do know in the press that Captain Crozier's first and foremost thought was the safety of his sailors. And that is pretty much how I would look at that, and it's how I did on Carl Vinson. I used to use a triangle, and it was an equilateral triangle: mission, safety, sailors. You can't do the mission without the sailors, and if the sailors aren't safe, you can't do the mission. And so that's how I approached it. So in that regard, I understood where he was coming from. So I think that's what he was thinking. Hey, I have to be able to balance the mission that I've been given with the sailors that I've been given and their safety. So I forgot the second question. I was writing fast, but
what do you think? What do you think he did right? Right, and
okay.
then what do you think he did wrong?
Okay, it's I will start that with I would never impugn those that have gone before me. I was not in his shoes and everything. So what did he do right? Well, he was doing what he thought was right by communicating. The question is, how well did he communicate? There's many ways. Email, as we know, is not very good because you can misrepresent something. Perhaps maybe this letter, which was in an email, was misrepresented in somebody's mind, like acting secretary of the Navy. He read certain parts of it that he might find offensive. Other people might go, that's normal. For instance, the part that I read that was interesting was he cited some surveys. Having gone to George Mason University, that was the first thing you do is you do research, and you look over the landscape. In nuclear power, we're supposed to cast a wide net before we focus down narrowly on an issue. So I think he was doing things correctly that way, but it could be misinterpreted. But there were phone calls. Chief of Staff Love did talk to him. Acting Secretary of the Navy did talk to him. All we know is what has been printed, that the SecNav with the CNN interview, which they had a conversation. The question, though, so that's what he was doing right. What was he doing wrong? I think when you look back, hindsight's 2020,
Right.
is that what he did wrong was misunderstand his position in a bigger issue. Yes, Theodore Roosevelt, very important ship, but we have about 11 of them. And oh, by the way, we have a lot more ships. And then you have the Navy Marine Corps team and the Army and the Air Force and the Coast Guard. And then you have the whole country. And then you get up to there. So he's one part of a big issue at the time. And he may have thought that misplaced the importance of his positions. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me just ask one more question and then switch to Janine. And the question is, put yourself back on the Theodore Roosevelt as the executive officer, right? And you're aware of what's happening, right? You're aware that sailors are getting sick. You're concerned that more and more of them are going to get sick. And your captain, wants to evacuate the ship. That's the decision that he's come to, right? And you know that he has had conversations with various people in his chain of command, and for some reason, right, he's been frustrated by those conversations. We don't know exactly what the conversations were, but he's frustrated, right? They clearly aren't listening to him. They clearly have not yet made a decision to evacuate the ship. What would you, as the executive officer, one-on-one with him, what would you have recommended him to do?
That is a very good question, Michael. And it's an important part for the executive officer to support his commanding officer in that role. Now, in the military, we try to teach everybody, think 2 levels up. So what does your boss's boss need, require? So in this case, that would be Vice Admiral Mers of 7th Fleet, who was the boss of Rear Admiral Baker, who was the strike group commander embarked on Theodore Roosevelt. So if you thought about what does Vice Admiral Mers need, you did a port visit to Da Nang. It was important enough to take that risk calculation, which turned out to be not such a good decision, but we understand why. Risk to mission, risk to force. He's fighting this whole battle across the Pacific to not contain China, that's probably the wrong word, but to deter China, okay? And yet we have this COVID, which could decimate the force, if you will, bring our readiness really, really low. So how do you help him do that, balance that? I think the XO probably helped the captain in this regard because they came up with a course of action. The recommended course of action from the commanding officer was to pull into port, let's offload as many people as possible, do the social distancing, clean the ship, and get back on the ship with a clean ship, a healthy crew, and then move back out to sea. So that was their recommended course of action. And I think it was frustrating to the captain that maybe higher ups did not share that support for his course of action. There were other courses of action. I'll call it incrementalism. Hey, we'll just take off the people who were sick at the time. Maybe that would have worked, maybe it wouldn't have. So there are other options, courses of action. And I think what the XO, the executive officer, should have been telling the captain is, you've got a good course of action. If they don't like that, keep pressing them on it. Support their course of action until the data comes to where you are correct. I think that's how he could have worked within the various levels of leadership above him without having to make such a rash decision in others' minds, the acting Secretary of the Navy.
Yeah. Maybe I'd ask you one more question, which is something I find very odd. So the captain of the aircraft carrier, right, is on the aircraft carrier, and then the strike group commander, right, which is in charge of the entire strike group, which includes the aircraft carrier, is also on that ship. How does that work from a leadership perspective?
Okay, you're talking about relationships, command relationships, and it is relationships. That admiral embarked will write your fitness report, which will say whether or not you will go on to make flag. That does come into the calculus. But I will tell you, Michael, most of the people like me, commanding officers of aircraft carrier, you go, I could, this is it. I'm happy. I've reached the pinnacle of my career. Flag is not what I was. None of us are going after flag. It is this ability to lead that 5,000 great sailors. You don't get that anywhere else. And so I don't think that was an issue. But personal relationships matter. I think Janine will tell you that. She did a great piece with Admiral Moran up in the Naval War College about relationships. We teach people in command that it's all about the commander's relationships. So in this case, if there was a rift, it's on both of them. Okay, it's not just one person's fault. You have to learn how to work together, because if you don't, maybe things like this happen.
Yeah. So Janine, I want to ask you essentially the same questions about the acting Navy Secretary, right? What do you think was going through his mind? What do you think he was thinking? What do you think he did right? What do you think he did wrong?
Sure. Well, can I back up a little bit? Because I think it's important to understand the roles of the civilian secretaries. You're appointed by the president. Bill Moran, when he was VCNO, Vice Chief of Naval Operations, and I was the undersecretary, we used to have these conversations a lot. And I don't, he would probably agree with me that he didn't totally agree with me when I first got there. But then when I said, look, I am not a commander. I am a Navy leader. I am one of the leaders of the Department of the Navy, and I have levers and you have levers, and I have roles and you have roles. It would never occur to me to dress down a bunch of sailors, for instance. Would I visit a ship? Sure. Would I give a pep talk? Maybe. but not in a commander way. And that's the delicate art of the whole civilian role. And unlike the military, nobody trains us for that. Nobody trains these political appointees. You know, they could pull me off of, you know, the car wash that I run or the Wall Street bank that I run and throw me in the Pentagon and tell me to do this job. And so that, I think, is a challenge for a lot of military folks. In my case, I was in the Air Force and I studied civil military relations. I thrive on this. I find it fascinating. But I think the first thing is, and we kind of blow over this, I think the first thing is, it appears to me that there is just a fundamental disagreement about the course of action that the captain of the ship was suggesting. And I think there's a lot of people that would say, you know, I don't think they say it in hindsight, which is maybe why they're flipping back. What do you mean? You know, when you sign up for the military, you're supposed to put yourself in harm's way. It's just the flu. Get over it. You know, it's going to be fine. And you've got to get that ship out into that AOR, that area of responsibility. You've got to get out there. That was the readiness that the fleet needed. And that's the disagreement, right? The captain of the ship is saying the clock is ticking and people are getting sick and people are going to die. So the course of action that Admiral Lizzie was suggesting, I think maybe he thought that wasn't going to happen fast enough, right? And we all, on the civilian side and on the military side, I mean, you know this, Mike, in your job, we always had this joke, if you're a civilian, if you're a political appointee, and I think every commander has this, you know, you've got your resignation letter, you know, in case it gets to the point where this is intolerable for you with respect to your values or something like that. And when I watch what happened with him, I feel like we do know that he was having these conversations. We know that there are 5,000 sailors on that ship calling their mom, telling them what was happening. You know, I mean, I had situations like this in the Air Force where it's a common pickle to be in as a commander. And the higher up you go, the more often it could potentially happen, where you have a course of action that you feel strongly about and your bosses don't agree with you. And you have a choice, and they teach this at the War College. You can either salute smartly and stay the course. You can continue a dialogue and see if you can convince them, or you can get to your point where you do something dramatic. You either resign or you throw up a flare. And this is a common conversation that we have in these war colleges when we do these case studies. If you resign and you don't say anything, is that a good, I mean, did you make the point? And so some people would say, oh, I would resign and I, you know, just be, you know, the gentleman about it. And others would say, I'll make them fire me. And I think that this is a situation of that on his part. Personally, so my point is you have to peel the onion back to the actual decision point. And this is where we can armchair quarterback, and I'm hesitant to do it, but I personally believe that the captain's course of action was the correct one. Pausing for 2 weeks to get the crew safe. A healthy crew is part of readiness. But that wouldn't have been my decision to make. And taking 2 weeks, that's where, you know, the idea that he overemphasized the importance of his ship. He actually was saying the opposite. He was saying, we can take 2 weeks, guys, and get this crew fixed and get them back out there. Or we can limp around the Pacific with a sick crew for 6 months. And that was the degree of disagreement. So back to your question about the civilian role. That's the kind of conversation that should be had in the uniform chain of command. I mean, as an undersecretary, I would probably be talking to the CNO, the Chief of Naval Operations. I think it's curious that there was some sort of a, you know, direct dial cell phone with the Chief of Staff of the undersecretary and this captain. Again, it says to me there was something different about this. There was something desperate about it going on, that people felt like they had to break all these normal lines. And so I would assume that it wouldn't come to an undersecretary or a secretary unless it got to a highly politicized position where congressmen are calling me because moms and dads are calling them. That's where the civilians start to get involved. And I won't be surprised if that was happening, right? Because we're in an age where you can't hide anything. You got social media, you got 5,000 sellers calling their moms, and their moms are calling their congressmen. And guess where that ends up?
Yeah.
In the White House,
Yeah.
and in the undersecretary and the secretary's office.
Yeah. Yeah. So Bruce, in a normal situation, in a decision to remove a captain of an aircraft carrier for cause, who would be involved in that decision? Would that go all the way back to the Pentagon or not?
Yes, the normal way, a relief for cause, say somebody collided two vessels, or in this case, what we have here, it is normally the immediate superior in command, and that in this case was Rear Admiral Baker, the embarked strike group commander, the person right over that captain, who says, "Hey, I've lost faith in his judgment or something, lost faith in his judgment, so a loss of confidence in his ability to command this ship." And he would recommend that to the fleet commander up through the chain of command, which in this case would go through 7th Fleet, Vice Admiral Bill Mers, up to the fleet commander, Admiral Aquilino. And he would spell out, this is why I have lost my faith in this person. Then each one of those individuals, Vice Admiral Mers and Admiral Aquilino, would have to probably agree and go, well, I don't see it that way. Tell me a little bit more. And normally there might be a preliminary inquiry, we call it, a real quick 3-day investigation to make sure we have the facts correct. And then if the fleet commander, Admiral Aquilino, believed that relieving that commanding officer was the right thing to do, he would craft an email to the CNO, Chief of Naval Operations, and say, so-and-so recommended to me, I concur that so-and-so should be relieved for cause. And therefore, the Chief of Naval Operations, trying not to do undue influence, would just acknowledge, copy, got it. And then we would have our Chief of Information and our Office of Legislative Affairs make some notifications to Congress, be prepared with talking points, and then we would execute the firing, if you will. And so it's coordinated. In this case, that the acting sec nav essentially reached down and then took that out of the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Aquilino's purview, is interesting. I have not seen that before. And so there's something happening that's different this time. And until that investigation that the Chief of Naval Operations has on his desk, we really won't know what the true cause was for that. But again, I think it would have been nice if the acting SecNav had just wound what we call the 60-second clock, taken 3 deep breaths,
That's right.
and then just pulled back. And I know he probably is thinking that right now, because what he did was reach down. And when you go fast, sometimes things aren't as they might seem.
Yeah. So let me ask you both, and maybe Janine, start with you. What do you think the key leadership lessons are from this really horrible 2 weeks?
Yeah, well, I think that Admiral Lindsay just hit on one of them, and that is, in a time of crisis, the first thing you should do is breathe through your nose. Mm-hmm. Take a deep breath, calm down. As a pilot, we would say, maintain aircraft control, analyze the situation, and take appropriate action. So that's a pause that you need to take and to gather the information. And I think that there was a little, at many steps, especially once the secretary got involved, once it got highly politicized, I think there was a little bit of panic that started to set in, and people make rash decisions when they're panicking. And so that would be my first lesson of leadership on that. The second is all the things that we're talking about in terms of the appropriate civilian military, sort of the norms, right? You start breaking down these norms, and then over time, secretaries reaching in and firing 06s. I mean, that's very low on the chain. It's 5 levels down, at least more than that, if you think about it. Even the CNO isn't the approval authority. He's just the okay. You start to break into the culture of these organizations, where then you have commanders who don't know what normal, what right is, and then you start to get in trouble, especially when if you get into a wartime environment and you do have to make quicker decisions. So I think you really have to. The reason we hold on to so many of these norms, I think, and they're curious about what the admiral thinks, is because it strengthens the culture on both sides, and that is all about relationships and decision making at the end of the day too.
Yeah. Bruce, do you want to add to the leadership lessons?
Yes, and to carry on with Janine there, I do believe the norms do inform our culture. Culture is the slowest to change. It is not monolithic. And so there will be change maybe in our culture, in the Navy culture out of this. But that's because the institutions matter, as Douglas North would comment on in his writings. So in the leadership part here, I wanted to also bring up one other thing. When forced as a captain with a decision, my boss, and I had those points when my boss did not like my recommendation. The first thing I would say is, I thought, hey, I am not the smartest man on the earth. I always used to say I'm fleet average. So 50% of you are smarter than me, and the other 50%, okay.
Good for you.
But that kept me grounded. So humility is one thing. And also knowing that maybe somebody has more information than I do, and that's why they're doing that. You being in the CIA, I am sure you had more information than I did on any given day. And so we need a fully informed decision and not just one lens. My father was in the Navy, prior enlisted, rose to be a captain, had 7 commands. And the one thing he told me was, you always get one chance to reclama, and after that, you carry out the order. And as long as it's a legal order, you're bound to carry out that legal order. Or you can protest, and the way you protest is you resign. I'm not really sure that you write a letter that goes wide, okay, in that. Maybe he thought that was the way to do it. But again, that's how I was able to get what I wanted of my boss. There's the direct method, and when that doesn't work, do indirect. But you have to get other people to support you, but not by blasting it out wide. You need to go to his chief of staff, Admiral Baker's chief of staff, and say, what am I missing about why this admiral doesn't like what I'm trying to do? Work within the chain of command, which is the chain of communication. And it comes back to, I think, the movie Cool Hand Luke. What we have here is a failure to communicate. And I think that is what happened. If you look at it, all those folks from the Assistant Secretary of the Navy on down to Captain Crozier failed to communicate effectively. And then look what happened to individuals, and look what happened to our institution. We need to learn from that.
So the session, maybe just one more question, and then we'll go to Q&A. This is a session about leadership in a pandemic, and we chose to use the Theodore Roosevelt as a case study. But let me ask you one more question outside of the context of the Theodore Roosevelt, and that is, we've now been in this COVID crisis for, 6 weeks or so, and I'm wondering, outside of the military context, is there a particular person who you think has shown particularly good leadership skills as it relates to the coronavirus, crisis? And I'll go first, to be fair, right? And I would say that the person who has impressed me the most from a leadership perspective is Dr. Fauci, who clearly has done 2 things that I think are incredibly important. One is he clearly listens to the experts that work for him. He clearly relies on them, right? He probably asks them 1,000 questions, which a good leader should do, but at the end of the day, he uses their expertise and he relies on their expertise. So I find that very impressive. And then I also find very impressive, because I come from a culture at CIA that is a speak truth to power culture, that he is willing to tell it like it is, even to correct the most powerful person in the world when he's standing on the podium next to him. I mean, that takes an incredible amount of institutional fortitude, and he has shown that over again. So he's my leader of the moment. So Bruce, Janine, you want to?
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you would choose Dr. Fauci, because his role is he's a leader, but he's an advisor, which I think is very much the agency's role, right?
Yes.
Of course, I immediately went to some of the executives that I'm seeing, which is I think that a lot of the governors have shown some seriously strong leadership in uncertainty. And even Dr. Fauci is so great because he presents the facts, but he also says where he doesn't know, right? He's like, well, we don't know. And this is uncertain. And that's where then the decision makers, the governors in this case, because so much has fallen to the state level, they have to make these calls in great uncertainty. And I think the California governor Newsom has done a great job. And even in my own state in Colorado, our governor was really way ahead of it. And one of the things that I really appreciate about our governor, Jared Polis, is his communication. Nothing is more important, and we didn't even talk about this, I didn't mention it before, in a time of crisis than communication. Yes. Communicate. You got to communicate in 3 dimensions, and he gets on, TV almost every night, and he says what he knows to be true, and he reinforces what he's trying to get people to do. And he tells where there's uncertainty, and he lays out the facts. And I think people have really appreciated that, even though the decisions are not easy. And they're really hurting us. I mean, the restaurants are closed, our businesses are going out, and those kinds of things. So the governors are my
that's fantastic
role.
Bruce, how about you?
I would say Governor Cuomo. And the reason I say that is because, for the same reasons Janine has said, in preparing for this, I looked and saw different frameworks for how you should go ahead and attack these things. You have to assess the environment. You have to align the team on the priorities of your plan, and you have to act on those priorities. And that has some skills. You have to be able to understand data science, Dr. Fauci. You have to be able to communicate and collaborate, and then you have to act effectively. And I think Governor Cuomo has done that. You've seen him. He is informed by the data. He's letting the experts help him with the data science part. But he is somebody real to the people of New York. So I think that's the key, as Janine said, communicate, but you have to collaborate. You have to get everybody on board, or else if you think you're leading and you look behind, nobody's behind you. So I think he has the residents of New York. I mean, look at the pictures. New York shut down like that, and they're doing that. Amazing. So Governor Cuomo, but I think the governors are doing a great job.
Yeah, that's great. So let's go to Q&A. Remember to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not the chat function. I see somebody's already posted a chat, so please use the Q&A function. Our first question is from Larry Pfeiffer, and I'm just going to put his name down because he runs the Hayden Center. So he's my boss at George Mason. So Larry is asking, exercises and tabletops can be really useful tools in preparing leaders for unexpected circumstances, whether it be a pandemic or some other kind of crisis. And Larry's wondering, and maybe Bruce, this is for you. Larry's wondering if the folks in this instance might have had the advantage of such exercises, and he also wonders if enough is being done to prepare our leaders for these types of events. So maybe Bruce, to you on that one.
I think I can speak to the military portion of this, and I say yes. NORTHCOM, Northern Command, which is responsible for the response, the military response in the continental United States, has the lead on the pandemic plan. So they had a plan, and you dust it off, you go forward. And of course, when a plan meets reality, it falls apart, and then you have to pick up from there. But so we have done those tabletops. We have done those exercises. So the military leaders are when I'm talking about the high level military leaders, are familiar with that. The question in this case comes down, was Captain Crozier ever exposed? I have experience and experiences. I can be 30 years in the military, but if I have never been exposed to something like this in a tabletop or an exercise, then I won't know how to react and everything. So I think perhaps maybe the one lesson learned is that in the military, we're going to have to make sure we have the young people who would be there in a decade exposed to that. I'll let Janine talk to the civilian portion of that.
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, one of my jobs was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Plans in the Pentagon. And one of the things I learned in that is the Eisenhower adage that the plan is nothing and planning is everything. And so what that means is that when we put together a plan, we choose a scenario, we think things through, we tabletop it out, and it doesn't survive first contact with the enemy. In this case, doesn't survive the first contact with the virus, right? A lot of what was predicted in these tabletops came true, and a lot of things were unusual and new. And so, but that's okay. It's not okay. I mean, it'd be great if we were completely prescient, but we're not. What the planning process does is it helps us know what to do when it happens, know who needs to come together and how to make the decisions. It's not a computer program that says, when this thing kicks off, this is what you're going to do. Boom, 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 boom. These are the decisions that are going to be made. It's more about, especially in the tabletop level, for decision makers at the higher levels, to know who's going to come together and who's going to have what roles and what are we going to do and what kind of information we're going to be looking for and what kind of indicators and warnings, to use Mike's terminology maybe, are we going to need to see whether things are tracking in a certain direction. So, and I think those kinds of things happen everywhere. Even at my university, we did a lot of contingency planning on this. People thought we were overreacting in January, and turns out we weren't.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So this next question I think is a fantastic one, which is what do leaders need in terms of skills to help them make decisions where there's an awful lot of uncertainty? Who wants to go first?
Okay, I'll take a stab at it.
Go for it.
The key in making decisions in uncertainty is to understand that you will never know it all and everything. So you're going to have to make a decision. The best way to make that decision is, I think, is to get a lot of other people to help you with that if you have the time to do so. You get a diversity of thought will help clarify your argument or your course of action that you need to do. The other part is, I learned at George Mason, was the art of suasion. If I cannot get you to think the way I'm thinking or agree with me, then somehow I am not bringing the right facts to the table. And that means that maybe I have some issues with my argument. But in the end, the leader will have to make a decision. But a leader who makes a decision and then is constantly revisiting that decision to see if the actions we took are getting us the outcomes that we thought, good. If not, okay, go back to the table of your advisors, seek some more information, and constantly adapt. But you have to be agile. That's a battle rhythm that a military leader is trained to do. The question is, how well did you get other inputs to that? Or are you groupthink and thinking only as the group that you have? Over.
Right.
Yeah, Janine, you want to add to that?
Yeah, thanks for that. At the university, I talk a lot about inclusive leadership. And what I mean by that is, I don't have all the answers, man, which is, I guess, maybe some humility, which I think is important. But I need help making these decisions. And I think when you get a lot of smart people in the room, when there's uncertainty, and my technique would be to game it out. If this is what we think is happens, where will it end up? And then if the second course of action is what we think might happen, the second scenario, then where might we end up? And then you take a look at like what's most dangerous, what's most likely. And that narrows some of the uncertainty down, but it doesn't eliminate it. And then I think that helps you make at least the first couple steps. And then you have to reevaluate again, just like you said, Admiral Lindsay, because it's going to change again. The farther out you go on that scenario planning timeline, the more the certainty starts to fray. And you have to, and there's no way you can, like, I'm not making decisions out to December right now, but I'm starting to think, we could still be having these issues in October and November. What does that mean? What kinds of decisions will we need to make by when? And you think about it that way.
Yeah. There's another fantastic question. These questions are great. So this question is how can we, and then put it in the sense of the U.S. Navy, how can the U.S. Navy and the Department of Defense learn from this event? right? What should happen so that there can be some learning from what happened here? Bruce, maybe start with you.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Gilday, has already instituted a investigation. I believe also the acting Secretary of the Navy, before he resigned, had asked for an investigation Pacific Fleet wide, essentially asking the question, how do we get here? Is there a culture to look at the culture also? Remember, it was in 2017, we lost 17 sailors with 2 collisions out there. So one would ask, okay, we've had that kind of relief for cause and we lost 17 sailors. Regrettably, we've lost 1 sailor from TR due to COVID. And we have this issue. So looking wide and saying, is there a cultural aspect to the Pacific that's different than the Atlantic side, is natural, compare and contrast. And so we're going to get those investigations and lessons learned. And then I think, just like we're talking today, this is a great case study to bring out questions. One of the things I'd like to bring up is lots of theory, but getting it down to practice, getting it to work on the deck plates is always the hardest thing. We always stumble in execution. So I think that's where we're going to go in the military, and it's going to come out. I think the Vice Chairman, General Hayton, is watching this very closely because it has ramifications for all the services. Janine?
Yeah, I'll say one thing about, I think it's super important to do after action reviews and to have a robust lessons learned process for any organization, business, universities, military, everything. The military has done an amazing job since Vietnam War in doing this better. And one of the key things that they've done and that we can't lose track of is when you go back and you do these lessons learned after action reports, that you have sort of a non-retribution mentality, that you're genuinely trying to learn. Because if you don't do that, people won't tell you what really happened. And it took a long time to change that culture. And I do worry that with so much that's happened in the Navy in the last 10 years, whether it was the whole scandal over what they call Fat Leonard, which was a lot of corruption out in the Pacific, to then the accidents that we had in 2017, and now this, that the culture is a little frayed. And I think that's going to take some leadership and some healing. And I think the getting to the ground truth of what's happened in these things is going to be important. With respect to those ship accidents, there's no one smoking gun on any of these issues. Like there's no, if we had only done that. There are institutional things, there are cultural things, there are leadership things, and all of those things come together. And then there's the environment. And so I think it's super complex, but that we shouldn't stymie us from investigating it. It's the most important thing to do in a situation like this. And the Navy really has some work to do on this. And I hope they do it well.
Here's another great question. Somebody is asking, how can we ask young seamen for an unqualified belief in the unified chain of command when that chain of command, right, just failed in resolving a disagreement and failed to the point of, having a great institution sullied, leaving a captain being called stupid on national TV, discrediting his character, et cetera, et cetera. How can we ask young seamen to, have a belief in that unified chain of command? And maybe I'll put it this way to you, Bruce. If you put yourself back on the Theodore Roosevelt again as the XO, and you're having a conversation with your seamen, what would you say to them? How would you talk about this from a leadership perspective so that you can put them at ease?
This is exactly what Captain Rear Admiral Select Carlos Sardiello is doing right now. He was the captain that was brought back to be there. That's tough because, in the military, we do have a chain of command. And so you're going to have to talk to your sailors and reinforce with them that, hey, this is not endemic of the entire Navies, all the various chains of command from this CO to that. This I think, is isolated only on this ship, this strike group, maybe. We'll find out if it's in that fleet, 7th Fleet, or in that fleet writ large, sink pack fleet from that investigation. So I let the sailors know we're investigating this because that's a very good question. And we have to build your trust back in the chain of command. And it starts with me, captain, and you, sailor. And we're going to talk. And anytime you want, come talk to me. I had an open door policy. It drove the chief's mess crazy. And I said, you got to remember, it's all about communication. The chain of command is the chain of communication. So if this sailor is having roadblocks in the communication, maybe it's the first class above him and it's not getting to the chief, and he knocks on my door, the first thing I'm going to ask him is, have you talked to your chief? And he's going to say no. You know that, I know that. And I'll say, well, I'm going to start with the executive officer and we'll work it down. You go back and talk to your first class. And I bet it's going to meet in the chief's mess. That is the center of the United States Navy, is the chief's mess. That's where things get done. So again, I would talk individually with the sailors. And I did every day on the 1MC, the thing the acting secretary of the Navy used to talk. I took questions from everybody. They played jokes on me up there because I would read everything. And one time I read The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, the lyrics, because I was not familiar with it. But that's how you regain trust, going, hey, you're a person too. I can come talk to you and work on that chain of command, chain of communication. I think that's so important, because if you do that, then they'll have faith in the rest of the chain going up. Janine?
Yeah, I think all that is everything I would agree with. It comes down to commanders with their sailors. I think also just reinforcing the role and the mission of the Navy, right? So sometimes at times like this, why are we here? What are we doing? Refocus those efforts in terms of, all of us on one side and the enemy on the other, as they say. I think that's really important. And, but, they're going to look at you like, well, why am I putting myself at risk if you guys don't know what you're doing, right? It's not necessarily true. And so I think being open, transparent, honest, coming across as human and approachable is super important for sailors. They need to have somebody to ask these questions to, and they need to not be fed, some BS. They need to be treated with respect. But I also think focusing on the mission and refocusing on, how important it is that we have carriers out there in the Pacific right now, and the work that they do and the way that they're trained, and they should take pride in that.
Yeah. Here's another super question. So what's the largest mistake that the three of us have made, and what did we learn from it? Janine, you want to go first?
Oh man, there's too many to choose from. I always hate those superlative questions. My son always asks me those. What's your favorite this? I mean, I've made many mistakes. I mean, I think probably some of my worst mistakes are not understanding the context that I'm in sometimes. And, this part of the reason why I'm so focused on breathe through your nose, take some time, get all the facts, is because I think, especially when I was younger, the need to just act was pretty strong as a young officer. And those are some of the things that usually led to poor outcomes or getting dressed down by my commander or those sorts of things. But
yeah, Michael, that's tough, because as Janine says, I used to tell my sailors, I make a mistake a day, at least one. My job is to try to make fewer mistakes each day that I live. And all. So I guess the biggest mistake that I've ever had in command was not getting to know all my sailors. And that aircraft carrier, that's tough. There's about 2,800 that are embarked just on the ship day to day. And then you have the staffs and the air wing come on. That's how you get up to almost 5,000. And it's sad because you go, I had a good plan because I said, hey, I'm supposed to be here for at least 2 years. Okay, that's 730 days. Okay, I need to get to know about 4 sailors a day. I mean, personally. And I started off really well, and then things overcame. So that's the biggest mistake, not getting to know your people, because when you have a crisis, that's not the time to get to know them. You need to lay that groundwork, that social capital in the beginning, so then when you have that conflict in the end, whether it's wartime or anything else, the sailors trust you. So that's my biggest mistake, is not making 100% contact with all my sailors on the Carl Vinson.
Yeah. Maybe I'll just add, from my own perspective, I won't pick the biggest mistake. I made mistakes every single day, and the point I would make, and my students at George Mason know this, is that I think it's important to every day think about the actions that you've taken and the decisions you've made, and think about whether they were the right ones, and think about what you did right and what you did wrong and what you could have done better, and be harder on yourself than any boss ever has been. And if you do that kind of self-assessment of your performance every day, you will grow dramatically in whatever profession you are in. So I'd leave people with that. I tried to learn from my mistakes, even when I was the only one who thought that I made a mistake, and other people didn't even know. Question here about kind of the proper role of the president in this. This is a tough question. The proper role of the president in this particular incident, and maybe let me add to that the proper role of the Secretary of Defense. Given how public this became, what do you both think the proper role of the SecDef and the president should have been in this situation? I know that's tough. Bruce, you want to go first?
Okay. The president is the commander-in-chief. That's the military part of it. And as an officer, you serve at the pleasure of the commander-in-chief. From the political side, he or she, okay, someday it's going to be a she, I think. We will that person is the head of their party, the political side. And then when you talk about civilians, they are the head citizen, if you will. So I think it's where it all comes together. The key for the military is reminding ourselves, we only have this lane. We are the military. We're apolitical. That is why we have civilian control over the military, so that we would never get out of our box. And I think that's really good. Again, also remember, so the president, I guess what I'm trying to get to is, he or she can do what they want because they are the head of our country in 3 different roles. Janine, you've got better insight than I do.
Yeah. Look, there's plenty of things the president, the SecDef, and the Secretary of the Navy can do. That doesn't mean they should do any of those things, for all the reasons we talked about, the norms and the culture. And my sense of the civilian role here is that like I would say, I was a Navy leader. I was not a Navy commander. The role of when you talk about civilian control over the military, what does that mean? It means the civilians are setting the strategic direction of the military, and they're saying, this is what we want the military to do. We're not supposed to be telling the military all the details of how to do it. Now, there are places where those lines get a little bit blurry, and you've seen it a lot. You saw it a lot in the Gulf War with Rumsfeld telling everybody how to do whatever, and there's all kinds of controversy about that. But that's where the blurry lines are. Way down here, firing a skipper of a ship or a captain of that is so far down, so far on the other side. The problem is that once the president has jumped over that blurry line, now you've got the Secretary of the Navy and the Secretary of Defense are in a bit of a pickle as well. So that setting that tone at the top about where, the civilians saying what needs to be done and the whys, and the leaving the hows to the military commanders. If you can't find that line at the presidential level, it's going to muddy the waters all up and down the chain. And that's what I think you see happening.
Yeah. So we are out of time. I want to thank Janine and Bruce for spending this hour with us. And I got a lot of notes in the questions about how appreciative everybody was of this session. So Janine, Bruce, thank you very much for taking the time. And thank you to everybody who joined us on this webinar. Thank you both.